Hey everyone, this is Hanney, critical faculty, saying hello to you one more time. I've already had an episode earlier today, and today I'm very honored to have. I'm getting a bit of feedback here. I'm very honored to have Dr. Richard Carrier. I've been in conversation with him over the last few weeks, trying to get his attention, and he gracefully accepted my invitation. And we've been chatting about what sort of topic we should present in front of you today. And I believe today's episode is going to be of a great value because it puts beliefs and hypotheses to a scientific formula where you can assess facts and hypotheses and basically come up with what should be the more plausible proposal in terms of whether there is a creator or God to this world, or naturalism is the most plausible sort of hypothesis or proposal in existence. So please welcome me in. Join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Carrier. Hello, Dr. Richard Carrier. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Excellent. I wanted to sort of give some intro to yourself, but I think I would like to give you the chance to tell people who you really are, instead of just reading a boring Wikipedia couple of sentences.
Yeah, Richard Carrier at richardcarrier.info. So people who want to learn more about me, everything is there at my website. PhD in ancient history, specialization intellectual history. So I do ancient science, origins of Christianity, but I also, whole other side, I do contemporary modern atheist philosophy. So I'm published in both fields. And so I have many books, I think 9 now I've got published. And my first book, Sense and Goodness Without God, A Defense of Metaphysical Naturalism, is the book that's most pertinent to what we'll be talking about today, where I actually build out and say, you know what, we can actually explain everything we observe in the world just with a naturalist worldview, an ontological naturalism, which is what we can talk about today. And what I do there is what hasn't been done since or before, really, which is in one book, make a positive case for our explanation for the world, rather than like there's a section on why God doesn't exist, but it's mostly about what should we believe rather than what shouldn't we believe. So I that's one of my focuses as a philosopher, is to actually talk about what should atheists believe, not just what we should reject. And so I do a lot of that positive worldview building, and that's epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, even like theory of beauty and all of that stuff. Like what sorts of things should we believe about the world? And that's I do a lot of that as well. So ancient history, contemporary naturalist philosophy, those are my 2 fields. And I write sometimes on social and political issues on my blog. So,
right. So, the word atheism itself is very misunderstood, especially in the Arabic world. It's most often associated with somebody who denies the existence of God, even though they sort of deep down they know God exists.
Yeah,
but they're denying it. But you're going to propose something slightly different, and I would like to know what that is.
Right. Well, first of all, with the whole attitude about the way scientific thinking about the world in general, the approach we take is not absolute certainty. There are some things that we think are so improbable that we can just not even bother with them, but we still admit that they have a non-zero probability of being true. It's just really small, It is possible that there is a cabal of evil lizard people running the world. That's possible, but we're assigning a very, very low probability to it. And so what we do is we talk about probabilities rather than certainty. It's not absolutely certain, or it's absolutely true or absolutely false. That's not what we do. We're talking about what is most likely and how much more likely. These are the questions that we ask about the world, about everything in the world. And so we apply that to every religious claim as well as every other claim that we run into. There are a lot of zany claims that aren't religious as well. Like we're dealing with QAnon, for example, that philosophy that's going around the globe today. But yeah, so we do, and even the lizard people thing. You think I'm joking? There are actually people who believe that lizards are running the world. But anyway, so as we run into secular versions of this as well, but we look at all of this stuff and we ask, well, based on the evidence, using logic, what is most likely the case. And so that is the approach that we take. And yeah, so it's not an absolute denial. It's just, you know what, I'm looking at everything, looking at all the data, and the God hypothesis is just not a good hypothesis. It doesn't really work very well compared to what what the alternatives are. The alternatives are very good. So
yeah, it's really interesting because what you've just explained is pretty much akin to the scientific method. There is an absolute certainty. It's probabilities and plausibilities, and that's how science works.
Yeah, I was just reading an article. Someone sent me an exchange of articles between a couple of philosophers, Pigliucci and this other fellow that was criticizing it, debating whether this one scientist tried to argue that, well, there's this claim that philosophy handles questions that science can't. And he wrote this big article about, no, that's baloney. In fact, the scientific method can be applied to everything. And Pigliucci, who was his primary target, who's criticizing, and I agree with Pigliucci, Pigliucci comes on and in his article, he says, no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that scientific method is a method of philosophy. And what philosophy does is that science can't get at everything right now. Yes, eventually we can get a scientific peer-reviewed paper answering every question. It might take hundreds of years from now, but we might do that. But until we can do that, we have to take the scientific method and apply it more informally to the world to come up with answers for what we need. And they won't necessarily be certain answers. All we need to know is what is the most likely explanation? And then science can come in later and really nail that down or change it even, overturn it. It's entirely possible that science could come up with evidence that overturns what we thought was the case. But philosophy, really, a lot of what philosophy does is it picks up where science, what we mean by science is formal science, like published peer-reviewed science. It has very, very high epistemic standards, really high. Most things in your life don't meet that standard. So most of the knowledge we have in the world is not at that level of certainty. But it is not, but that doesn't mean it has no certainty that we don't know anything about it. We do have some certainty about all that other stuff. And that's what philosophy deals with. And so think questions like whether gods exist and the supernatural in general, which is, we should talk about what is the difference between natural and supernatural explanations. We have some scientific peer-reviewed stuff on that. We have prayer studies, for example, that have done a very good job of proving that prayer has no measurable effect on the outcomes of various illnesses, for instance. But we don't have that for everything, but we don't need that for everything. We can use the evidence of our senses, of our daily lives, of news articles. We can actually rely on lots of evidence, of course, all the stuff that science has figured out. We can look at what science does know, and we say, well, given this, what's the most likely place that science is going to end up in 1,000 years? We actually can make that projection based on the data and information available. And that's a lot of what philosophers are doing, especially in naturalist philosophy, which is philosophy of naturalism.
I absolutely love what you just said now, because I don't have that sort of separation between philosophy and science. As a matter of fact, I believe science is the natural evolution of philosophy, because you think about it.
No, you're absolutely right. Go on, though.
You're trying to seek knowledge and seek wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And 2,500 years ago, the tools available was just your brain to sort of use induction and inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning to get where you want to be. But now we've devised a tool to find better information, and it should be adopted. And it is part of that the pursuit for knowledge and for better understanding of the world we live around. So I don't think there is that much of a separation, really.
Yeah, this relates to the person who sent me those articles I was just talking about. I can't remember where they were in. Maybe the Skeptic magazine. But the thing that really when I was reading them, I was like, oh, I've actually already talked about this. From the other side, I did an article you can find on my blog, Is Philosophy Stupid? I did a talk, and then I have a note sheet that you can go to on that. And you can find all this on my blog. But Is Philosophy Stupid was the title of my talk. And I was addressing scientists who say philosophy is useless and reject it. Scientists who say that usually say that in books that they wrote that actually are qualified as philosophy. But anyway, where they claim to have conclusions that we would call conclusions in philosophy, not science. But what I show in that is because my field is history, so I show historically that in fact science is just a branch of philosophy. In fact, science is just philosophy with better data. Is really all it is, right? So and you can show that until about the early 20th century, we didn't even distinguish them. Like, so if you look at, when Darwin published his theory of evolution, he published it in a philosophy journal. When people talk about who Darwin was, they didn't call him a scientist. Maybe occasionally they did, but usually they'd say, no, he's a biological philosopher, or, or he's a natural philosopher or an experimental philosopher. The thing is that there was no the demarcation was not strong between philosophy and science. That started in the early 20th century, where scientists wanted to kind of like professionalize and denigrate philosophy as not real science. And so there's this huge divide between science and philosophy. But that was just evolved out of political and social interests. It wasn't really, like, in terms of history, science is just philosophy with better data. It's the same methods, but you've got more money you can throw at it, more resources you can apply to it, and you have more access to the questions you want to answer. And so that's it. When you do philosophy really, really well, what you end up doing is science. And then the rest of philosophy is we just don't have the tools or money or technology to test the questions that we want to test. But we have some data, so we can do something with it. So it's not it's not between like you can't know anything or you can do it scientifically. There's this whole area in between those two possibilities where you can get some decent knowledge. It's just not knowledge of the modern scientific level, really. So
yes. And I mean, that separation happened some 2,700 years ago. The Sufis, where they're trying to say, well, knowledge is really unknowable. It's very difficult to know anything. And then that conversation between never really took place, but Plato and his student, who they're departed. Plato said, that famous Raphael painting of Plato saying, "Hey, knowledge is over there. We're just learning forms or trying to remember forms that we lose at the time of the birth because of how shocking it is, and we're trying to rediscover knowledge that's already been there." And Aristotle's got his palm, to the ground, saying, "No, it's here. It's here for us to explore." And I think that was the point where science started, really.
Yeah, truly. In my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, I do talk about the progress of science, and I do go back to Aristotle. I talk about the pre-Socratics, the ones before him. So there were kind of like proto-scientists, Thales, for example. But Aristotle's the first to really systematize and create a formal field of science, which to him was just natural philosophy, right? That was the word science wasn't a distinct thing back then. No, they called it natural philosophy, but it's the study of nature, and it was empirical. That was his push, is that it should be empirical. And he started it. And then after him, like, the methodologies really grew up significantly. When you look at the scientists in ancient Greece and Rome after Aristotle, they blew right past him. Like, they're way more advanced than Aristotle. But Aristotle started the conversation, set the parameters. So I think he's a crucial figure in the history of science, for sure.
Yeah, he still got a few things wrong, like the prime mover situation, but that's the only thing that he could see. He could see things move because we inflict some action on them, and therefore they move. Now we know better.
People often forget, like Aristotle himself says, like, well, this is what I think, but if you can get evidence, you can refute me, right? Like, that's his whole point. And so, like, people forget that part of the sentence. But then later, one of the mistakes he made, for example, Aristotle thought the brain was just a cooling organ and that thought went on in the heart. That was one of his errors. But within 100 years of him, you have Herophilus and Erasistratus, these Alexandrian medical scientists, completely refuted Aristotle and proved that thought is in the brain. They'd even localized functions, so they knew where sight was and where hearing was. They were able to trace the nerves from the brain into the tongue and the larynx to show that speech and thought come from the brain. So they completely refuted Aristotle within 100 years using Aristotle's own method. Like Aristotle said, do this, and they went and did it and said, oh, well, Aristotle was wrong. And that's science, right? Aristotle would have been proud of that. It's like, yeah, that's what you should have done, right? Like, I made a guess, I was wrong, but you came in with evidence and proved me wrong. Excellent, that's science. And so, like, really, Aristotle's the one who started that idea that you could do that. Evidence could actually refute the great thinker, because the great thinker is limited to the evidence, right? So evidence has to be the greater authority, not the individual, basically.
Yeah. And I think this is it's a beautiful segue to our conversation today, because what perceives what? I mean, what it's like an egg and chicken situation. Do you have ideas in your head and you try to apply to the natural world, or you first observe the natural world and see what's happening, all the data, and then you compare 2 different propositions or 3 or 4 to see if they fit the data. And this is where the conversation is going to take place.
Yes. Yeah, you always need to compare, right? So you can't, this is the way I put this. I've done a few articles on my blog on this, but the way in probabilistic reasoning, you can't prove something is true without proving something is improbable. You can't prove something is probable without proving something improbable. You have to actually show that competing explanations are unlikely, and that's the only way that your explanation can be likely. So you do have to take alternative explanations seriously. Now, in most of the time, we're talking about multiple competing natural explanations. We've gotten to the point now in science, it's been 200 years or so since the scientific revolution. The amount of knowledge base that we've accumulated has made it extremely unlikely that any supernatural explanation can compete. And then we're willing to see someone come in with one that will work, but so far they're the least likely. They're like the last hypothesis you would ever come up with nowadays. And that's for a reason. That's an evidence-based reason. It's like we've stacked up all this evidence over 200 years, and it's like, you know what, these supernatural explanations have never turned out. Like, they've never worked at all. Whereas natural explanations are super fruitful and always end up being correct in some form or other. So that's the place we go looking, right? And it's not that science is against, like, absolutely won't let supernatural explanations in. It's just, if you do, you've got to have the evidence. Like, you really need to come in and be able to show that that's the case. And no one's been able to successfully do that so far.
My audience is mostly from the Middle East, Dr. Carrier. So we've got lots of ex-Muslim, and we've got still some Muslims and some Christians because, for example, Egypt is about 10 to 15% Orthodox Christians, as you know, and they're one of the most religious in terms of Christianity. The Egyptian Christians are very, very religious people, and there is that sort of it's very in vogue at the moment. It's very fashionable to try to reconcile religion and science, and therefore you get all these scientific miracles in the Quran and in the Bible and stuff like that. So, but when you really put them to the test, they're not, like, nowhere near. They're missing the mark by like miles. But they reckon there might be some conspiracy. Where, it's like, for example, there's a hadith in Islam where Prophet Muhammad supposed to have split the moon in 2 to show a miracle to the unbelievers. And obviously the repercussions of splitting the moon is huge, but it happened apparently. But they believed NASA's actually hiding that because there are some pictures were taken in the moon, and you can see the valleys and some sort of mountain range on the moon, but they reckon these are the after effect of splitting the moon into 2, and they kind of super glued it together.
I have not heard of this, but I'm not surprised at all.
This is true.
Right. This kind of thing happens a lot. There's the one about the hell was found by miners in Russia. And that's a big cover up. The missing day in the Bible, that's another NASA myth. The myth about NASA is that there was that when during the battle in the Old Testament when God stopped the sun. And so supposedly there's some sort of NASA proof that actually happened, which is ridiculous. But no, this is modern mythology. When you go digging in and you find it, no, it actually doesn't hold up at all. But yeah, to find that out, you really have to go into the science. Like, look into the science of lunar mountains. Like, there's a whole science of this. We've done a lot of work on this. We sent people there, So and it's fascinating. You can learn a lot of cool stuff. So I encourage people to, like, go look at the actual legitimate science on this stuff. It's interesting to know why these things don't work out. Like, why the myth about NASA covering up the missing day doesn't make sense. To understand that, like, teaches you things about history and calendrics and how we know anything. So it's actually a really interesting deep dive to do, and it can be fun to do. So I recommend people go looking at the debunking of this, go look at this real science behind it so that you understand why the myth doesn't make sense. And then the end result will be, not only will you realize that the myth is myth, but you'll have learned a lot of cool stuff as well, and you'll start to get a better sense and a better understanding of how scientific thinking works. And then you can apply that thinking to your whole life, like any aspect of it.
Right. You've mentioned ontology, so obviously the essence and the being there, and from there maybe we can derive some epistemology. So can we maybe start displaying some of the current information that we know, we all sort of sure of, and start comparing it with the 2 models, whether there's a deity or not?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I'll pick one. Basically, so this is a thing that I don't think people realize. So you take any argument for God, any argument that people try to make to argue that there is a God or that God is probable. It doesn't matter what it is. Pick any one. In actual fact, what you'll find is that argument depends on hiding evidence. It depends on taking evidence out. And when you put that evidence that's missing back in, it flips the argument the other way, and it actually becomes an argument against God. It becomes an argument that God is actually the least probable explanation. And I'll pick one just at random. I'll pick one of these, which is the argument from consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. The argument is that, well, consciousness is so inexplicable, and why do we see colors? Like, colors don't exist in the world. It's like there's this nature of what it is like to be a thinking person. We can't explain consciousness. Therefore, it must come from the ultimate consciousness. Therefore, it must come from God, right? Our consciousness must be a reflection or fragment or imitation of God's consciousness, and that's the only way it could exist. That's the supernatural explanation. The natural explanation is that this is an emergent phenomenon, that consciousness is just what it is like to have a complex information processing machine that can integrate information so well. And it is just an emergent property of a natural physical thing, the brain. Because these are two competing explanations. Now, you can look, if you could just leave it at that, you could say, well, I don't see how nature or how physical machinery can explain this at all. I was like, well, okay, let's bring some evidence in that you're not taking into account. So we have multiple different ways of determining that consciousness is produced by the brain. One is you can take pieces of the brain out and pieces of consciousness go with it. Another is you can stimulate it. You can electrify parts of the brain and make it do things in consciousness. We have the animal scale. So you can find structures of the brain disappear when you go further back in evolution. And you can see that, and those animals' cognitive abilities correspond with the physical structure of their brain. And there's many other things like this, but that all point in the same direction. And but the more interesting things is the brain is huge. It has to be massive and complicated. And you would expect, like, consciousness would have to be a really complicated phenomenon. So the brain, if physicalism is true, the brain would have to be really complicated. Well, look what it is. It is really large and complicated. It takes about 20% of our energy and nutrition. So we're wasting 20% of our food and energy just keeping this brain working. It's super vulnerable. It's very fragile. The skull is needed to protect it, but even the skull is not that great a protection. It's very easy to damage the brain. So why do we have this? Why do we have this extremely fragile, energy hog, absurdly complicated organ? What do we need it for? If we can be conscious without the brain, why do we need it? But now you can explain this on naturalism. You can say, well, on naturalism, there is no great consciousness. There is no God. There is no way to have thought. Thought is always an emergent property of matter. Thought comes later. You have to construct it, right? The basis of reality on naturalism is just physical things: space, time, matter, and energy. That's it. So if you're going to have thought, if you're going to have consciousness, it has to be something that emerges from. It has to be something you can build out of those things. So we would expect that. And if you look at the science, you can say, well, the only way that you can have consciousness is with a very large complex organ. By its nature, it would have to be extremely draining energy-wise. By its nature, it would have to be very fragile. It would be almost impossible to make it much sturdier than that. And then you could add even other things, like it has to be large, which actually kills women. The infant maternal mortality rate is actually unusually high for humans compared to other animals, because there's a sort of sweet spot between where hips are too large to be useful or they're too small to give birth. And so women have evolved to have wider hips, but not too wide. But then the conflict between the hip width and the brain size that has to come out actually leads to a much higher maternal mortality rate for humans than other species. And that has to do because we need this large brain. We have to have it to have the consciousness that gives us the advantages that outweigh the loss of women in childbirth. So all of these things make sense. It's exactly what you would expect. In fact, it's the only way we could have consciousness if there's no God. The only way that we can have consciousness if there's no God is exactly the way we observe that we have it. This large energy hog, fragile brain that kills mothers and otherwise wouldn't have been needed. If you look at the God hypothesis, well, God could just give us souls. We don't need brains. None of that stuff is necessary. So the God hypothesis doesn't explain all of that stuff, whereas our hypothesis does explain all that stuff. And more to the point, is why you could ask the question, why would God make the universe look exactly like a universe with no God in it? Because he'd have to have gone out of his way to do this, right? To give us the brain, which is the only way that we could have consciousness if there's no God. So he went out of his way to make the world look like a godless universe with this brain, and then doing a lot of damage to us in the process, making us very vulnerable, making us very fallible, and all of this. It's very improbable. Now, of course, you can come up with explanations. You can reason your way. Well, maybe God did this for X, Y, and Z. But you don't know any of those reasons are true. You're just making that up, right? So what we're saying is it's not impossible that God would make the world this way. What we're saying is that this is the least likely way a God would do this, right? It's not a probable way. You can't start from God and deduce 100% chance that he's going to do it this way. But from the other side, on the naturalism, we can say this is 100%. This is what we would expect to observe. This is exactly what we would have to observe if there is no God. So the evidence is very probable on our theory. It's not so probable on the competing theory. And that difference in probabilities is what we call evidence. That's what makes the probability of the conclusion higher, is when the evidence is more likely on one theory than the other, then that one theory is more likely to be true, all else being equal. And so that's just one example of the argument from consciousness. Put evidence back in, it flips the other way and becomes an argument against the probability of God.
Sure. And if consciousness can exist independent of the brain, which the theist might say, well, it resides in a spirit or in a soul, then you wouldn't think the brain is necessary then. But you've got lots of cases like that particular gentleman who had, I think his right hemisphere was an atheist and the other one was a theist within the same brain. You damage part of the brain and your linguistic skills are no longer there. Even a gentleman who developed pedophilia because of a tumor gets operated on. Pedophilia is gone, gets a tumor back again, it's back again. And that's a sort of a condemned thing.
Yeah, that's a good example. Is like how easy our brain breaks, like how badly designed it is. Like that's I often tell people, like, go to Wikipedia and type in list of cognitive biases. And Wikipedia has this huge list. It's like 100 things. And each one of those things are design features of the brain that are broken. Naturally broken, not like, we're not talking tumors or anything like that. This is how we're born, how we're made. The brain is designed to think badly, and we have like hundreds of examples of this. And that the brain is really badly designed. Now that makes sense on evolution, because evolution's not intelligent, right? It comes up with what it can, but so we get sort of this hodgepodge thing that the stuff is useful but not perfect, basically, is like slightly better than bad, which actually weirdly explains superstition, explains belief in the supernatural. But you had mentioned the person who had two hemispheres with different beliefs. For people who might not know why, that's in cases of what's called split brain patients. There's a form of epilepsy that, to cure it, or at least the best treatment we've come up with for this particular kind of epilepsy, is to sever all the connections between the two halves of the brain. Now, we don't sever all the connections. It's the upper part of the brain, the cerebral cortex. So we separate the two halves of the cerebral cortex by going in and literally cutting the wires, basically. And when that happens, the two halves kind of can't talk to each other, don't really know about each other, right? Like that you can, like if you speak, they can both hear what you say. So that's one way to get information from one half to the other. But if you put a board here and have one eye look at one thing and one eye look at another thing, each hemisphere doesn't know what the other eye is looking at, right? So you can actually send information independently to different halves of the brain. And then also different information is stored in different sides of the brain. So like certain things like supernatural belief might actually be stored in one side of the brain and not the other. So yeah, this is an example of like, if you go in and start physically dinking with the machine the consciousness starts acting weird. And you can get two separate people in one. So have you created two souls by just severing a few wires in the brain? Like that's not a good explanation. Whereas the physical explanation is like the brain is just a machine that's generating consciousness. Obviously, in a machine, if you cut the wires, you're going to cut off information between two halves. We have a full explanation. We don't need any more explanation than that. And so that's an example of how naturalism does better as an explanation of things. And you could pick anything. We've chosen I chose consciousness just as an example. But you can choose anything in the world, from morality to beauty to cosmology to whatever it is. And it breaks down the same way. Naturalism always ends up a much better explanation.
I mean, two of the biggest philosophical arguments against the existence of God, and we can use them today to sort of, let's compare the data sort of thing. The problem of evil, and especially gratuitous evil, not just all evil, because people might come and say, clever ones, and say, well, there is a good reason for it. It's for personal growth and all that. I don't want to BS. and the problem from divine hiddenness. So these are two strong arguments. So maybe I think to me, the problem from divine hiddenness is actually the stronger of the two.
No, they're good. Those are good examples of what we're talking about, and both of those are flipped arguments. Right. So there's usually one of the arguments for God is, oh, look at all the good in the world, all of the, the plane crashed and I survived, therefore God. Right. And yeah, but what about the other 100 people who didn't survive that plane crash? So it's like, it's that kind of thing. But yeah, the argument from evil, and you're right to qualify gratuitous evil is the key thing there, is another argument from probability. You can say it's improbable. And if you compare today, let's compare today to 2,000 years ago. Look at what we've got in medicine. Look at what we've got in safety, just road safety, in the ability to make buildings resistant to earthquakes, the sanitation, our ability to keep the world clean, including having clean water, which is people take that for granted. People in the West take that for granted. Clean water, right? And I say they really do take it for granted. We have a lot of people in America who are completely oblivious to how much money and infrastructure and government regulation and stuff goes into making sure that they always have clean water available, and how important that is, what it is like when you don't have that. And that's, I list a few things. We can keep going on, but it shows that 2,000 years ago, we didn't have all that stuff. So why is it that humans can make the world a better place, but God couldn't, right? Like, God has more resources than us. It costs him less. He is less vulnerable to any kind of thing. He's smarter, supposedly. He knows more stuff, right? Like God is just an extension of us in a sense. Like, he's a better version of us, supposedly. So if we can do all this stuff, he could do even more stuff to make the world a better, safer, more just place. But he doesn't. Now, this is completely 100% expected if there's no God, right? If there's no God, then the only way to fix the world is if we do it, because we're the only intelligent agents around who can take action and work together to make the world a better place. And when we look at history, that's it. The only time it ever gets better is when humans were and themselves. And that's exactly what we expect. But it's not what we expect if there's a God. And you can even say, what about all those excuses you could make for maybe why God would make the world look exactly like a world with no God in it? Yes, you can come up with all those excuses, but you don't have any evidence that any of those excuses is true. Consequently, the probability of the evidence is low. You could say it's not zero. Doesn't matter. It's still low. It's not what we would expect. It's not highly probable on the God hypothesis. Whereas this evidence of the gratuitous evil that you're talking about is highly probable. In fact, it's 100% likely if there is no God. So the probabilities disparity is huge, right? So the naturalism makes the evidence much more likely than theism does. And so that's how the argument from evil works. And you mentioned the divine hiddenness. Now, I frame this in my Bayesian counter-apologetics article for people who want to check that out. You can find it on my blog. Just look for counter-apologetics on my blog and you'll get it. But it's the argument from religious experience, right? So the flip side of divine hiddenness is that, but I experience God in my soul, and that proves that God exists. It's the religious appealing to a religious experience. The apostles saw the risen Jesus, religious experience, and even when I was a Taoist, I was a devout Taoist. I genuinely felt the Tao in me and moving and myself moving in accordance with the Tao. And that proved to me that the Tao is real and Taoism is true, right? So you could pick, every religion has this. There's some sort of religious experience that convinces the person. And this is the good example of the leaving evidence out and putting it back in. So the Christian or the Muslim who appeals to religious experience as evidence for God, they're just focusing on their experience, isolated individual experience, and leaving out all the evidence of the other experiences. When we put all that evidence back in, the argument flips the other way, because now we've got 10 different people who all claim a direct religious experience to completely contradictory different religious perspectives. Now, this doesn't make sense. It's not probable if there's a real God. If there's a real God, everybody should be getting the same information and should have been getting the same information for 40,000 years. Like, you should go back, you know, whatever gospel you're teaching, whatever religion you are, it should go back to the beginning. We should be able to confirm that multiple independent cultures were getting the same information independently of each other, so that when they meet, they go, oh, look, we were given the same information this whole time. That's what you would expect if there was a God who really wanted people to understand the truth, or at least the truth about himself, truth about religion. But let's flip it the other way. What about naturalism? What does naturalism predict? Well, naturalism predicts that supernatural belief in gods, will be an emergent phenomenon, an accident of consciousness, a cognitive bias, essentially. And so it would be driven by culture. So independent cultures will come up with completely different religious experiences. Over time, as cultures change, the religious experiences will change. And so we can predict that as a false belief system. And the fact that we have diverse, like, religious experiences, so diverse and so contradictory, not only overall the world today, but throughout history. Like, even the same culture, look back in time, the religious experiences keep changing radically and contradictorily. And so, especially if we go back thousands of years. So naturalism actually explains the state of religious experience. It explains why you think you've experienced God. And I had mentioned earlier how cognitive biases explain belief in the supernatural. One of those is, one of the reasons is that as we were evolving, as we were growing up as apes and then hominids in Africa, it was more useful. If you think of it this way, the usual analogy that's given for this, it's called agency over detection. So if you hear a rustle in the grass behind you, and there's a tiger about to pounce on you, and when you turn to look, well, now you can dodge the tiger, right? That's the basic idea. Now, if you turn to look and it was just the wind, it hasn't cost you very much. Like, turning your head didn't cost you a great deal. So it's cheaper to be fooled into thinking there's a tiger than to be hyper accurate as to whether there's a tiger. So we actually evolved to over-detect agency in the world. We have a tendency to see agency where there is no agency, because that way we will see agency when there is agency. So our false negative rate is low, but it does result in our false positive rate being high. We perceive agency when there isn't agency, but the cost of false positives on that is low. So we actually, that's our brain evolved to do this. It just over detect agency as just sort of a sloppy, easy way to keep us from, right? Reasoning perspective. But if your goal is to have a hyper accurate view of reality, this is a terrible way to do it. Like, our brain is badly designed for this. But this means that we need to look for when we are over detecting agency, when we're seeing too much agency in the world when it's not there. And this theory, which it has been tested multiple ways and proves out, but also explains a lot of history of religion, because religions began animistic, where trees had souls, the sky had a soul, the storm is always God's doing it. Everything had a soul. Everything is, gods are in everything. That's agency over detection. And then as we built civilizations with hierarchical social political systems, kings on top and so on, we started amalgamating these gods into hierarchies of pantheons, with one at the top. Eventually, the one at the top sort of eclipsed all the others. So we get to monotheism, essentially. And so that's really just a political, cultural phenomenon of channeling agency over detection. And so we can explain the whole history of religion, why it changed the way it did, why it's so diverse, why it's diverse in the particular ways that it is. We can explain all these peculiar features of religion just with a naturalist theory of the brain. Whereas theism does not do a good job of explaining any of this stuff, quite frankly.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, the two problems that we've posed, and I've got sort of a couple of comments on them: a problem of evil and the problem of from divine hiddenness. They're all sort of probing the justice, the divine justice, And one thing that always sort of, because you get a lot of apologists would say, like, these things need to happen because you learn from them. Even natural disasters, which is supposed to be gratuitous, but they say, well, this is helping now humans to devise technology and to get over all these things. But the one thing that never really sat down well with me is we're only 300,000 years old, Homo sapiens, and this is arguably where conscience sort of started. But we're talking even about before the genus Homo started altogether. Let's go back 2 million years ago. We're talking about 500 or 700 million years of sentient beings being killed, tortured, and we are not there to witness and draw any wisdom from. What was that about? There is no wisdom there. It's gonna have to be an evil god at that point, really.
Certainly a extremely callous, sociopathic, indifferent god, right? And this is the key thing, is like, once you're talking about a god, you're not talking about blind nature anymore. You're talking about a mind which has values, intentions, goals. I mean, the thing that separates an intelligence from a non-intelligence is that the intelligence has objectives and can figure out logically effective ways to achieve those objectives. So we do this in courts of law all the time, where we say, like, well, we see what this person did or didn't do, and we can infer from that what their intentions were, like what their objectives were, right? If someone's, watches someone being robbed and does nothing to help them, like, we know, well, like, okay, they might have feared for their safety. That's a good reason not to do that. But of course, a god doesn't fear for his safety. So if the person we're talking about is an armed police officer and they're watching someone being robbed and they didn't do anything about it, well, that guy would go down for malfeasance, right? He'd get fired. He could possibly even be sued for not doing his job. And that's just a vulnerable human who can be killed. And we're just saying, well, he's got a gun and he's trained with it and that's his job. He should be able to do it. Imagine if he's literally invulnerable, like you can't kill him. And then he doesn't do anything. Like, imagine we had invincible police officers and they see someone being robbed, being beaten or whatever, and they just, I'm not going to do anything about that. You still have to explain the motives. Like, what would motivate someone they can't even be harmed, so they have no excuse to not intervene. What is their motive? You have to infer what their motive is. And when you start looking at that and you're trying to come up with excuses, well, he wanted to teach them a lesson, that's a bastard. That's a bastard way to teach a lesson. Like, only an awful, abusive parent would use things like that. I mean, there's a funny scene in a TV show in America long ago where there are these two parents, the concerned mother and the brash, sociopathic father. They're both looking down, watching their kid, and he's about to stick his fingers in the light socket. And the mom goes to go, oh, no, honey, don't. And the father goes, no, wait. And then the kid gets shocked, electrocuted, and he goes, see? You won't again. And that is, but of course that could have killed the kid, right? In the real world, that could have been a dead child just there. And it's like, well, you should have learned your lesson, I guess, somehow halfway through. Okay, we can't really work out how the lesson gets learned there. You're a lesson for someone else. We're going to do something horrible to you to teach a lesson to someone else. That's the ticket. Yeah. No, this is the teaching method of a sociopath, right? Of a callous, amoral, kind of cruel being, whereas a good teacher would not teach that way, right? A good teacher would stop the child and explain why they shouldn't put their fingers in the socket, right? That's what a good teacher is. And we know that from their actions, right? By their fruits ye shall know them is the Christian phrase, right? You know the difference between a good teacher and an awful, vile, callous teacher by how they teach, right? So that's the only way you can tell the difference between them. And so when we see the examples in the real world, we see what good teaching looks like. We see what callous, awful, abusive teaching looks like. And when we look at the world, if you're going to posit that there is an invincible person with unlimited resources and infinite knowledge, then you're creating a scenario where you're forcing us to infer there's only one inference left at that point, is that this is an extremely callous, cruel person that you're talking about. It's much better to it would be better off if we didn't have that person, right? Like, so like naturalism actually is more comforting. It makes more in a way, right? It's like well, we don't have, at least we don't have that, sociopath, invincible sociopaths. I mean, come on, that's not a good thing to have in the universe. So, Anyway, so that kind of illustrates the point
Yeah.
I think you're getting at.
Yeah, even our sort of upbringing children at the moment, that's evolving as well. I mean, that sort of scenario that you're
Good
showing.
example, right?
These are probably baby boomers and older generation thought this is the way to build up a strong son or a strong child. That's what they did then. But now we know better, so we are evolving.
Yeah.
But the argument from divine hiddenness has a very similar challenge for God, which is divine justice. Because if you remember, the Schellenberg put it that way. It was very much centered around non-resistant non-belief, and basically, if there is one person who's sincere in finding God, not resisting, but can believe because there's no evidence, and that person is going to end up being doomed to hell, then just one person is enough to debunk the justice of God. And I know, like, I'm pretty sure most of the atheists who've been thinking about this were pretty much open to the experience or the knowledge if it's going to come through, but we're still waiting. There's nothing we can do. So
yeah,
again,
I mean, for me, like, no matter what it is, and in fact, if you can take the case of myself where I actually have an audience and I actually am influential, wouldn't it behoove God to come down and have a conversation with me, right?
yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like of all people, but God has unlimited resources. It's not like me. I can't personally go talk to every person on the planet, 6 billion people or whatever. But God has unlimited resources. He's not limited that way. And it's all the excuses people make are excuses that have to do with limitations, the limitations that are upon us. Like, we're vulnerable. We have limited resources. We have limited time. We're not that smart. We're pretty fallible. But none of these are, by definition, the way people are constructing their hypothesis, their God doesn't have these limitations. So these excuses don't work. Like the example I gave when I had a famous debate, actually, with Muslim apologist Hassanein Rajabali. It was Hassanein Rajabali and Michael Corey were apologists defending God on one side, and it was me and Dan Barker on the other side. And you can still find video of this online. And it was like a 4-hour long debate. The audience was huge. We had about 1,000 in attendance. Almost all of them Muslims, came in from all over the world. So I got to meet and talk to Muslims from many different situations, right? So Islam is different when versus Turkey versus Syria versus Indonesia, right? And or Tanzania. Like, I got to meet lots of different people with different perspectives. But in that debate, one of the arguments that was made was that, well, I think Dan Barker had mentioned volcanoes. He mentioned there was a recent incident of a volcano killing lots of people. So what's the point of volcanoes? Like, there's no point. And then they get up there and their defense was, well, God has to circulate the elements somehow. And that was their defense. And I'm like, no, God is unlimited. He is teleport the elements if he needed to circulate them. He didn't need horribly violent, destructive, liquid magma burning people alive. He doesn't need that. Like, I don't know what kind of limited God you think you're dealing with, but no, you've defined God as having unlimited resources and means. He could just teleport if he needed to circulate the elements. I mean, he designed the world. Why would he design the world that needed elements circulated? I don't know. But if he did, he could just teleport them or have them move any number of ways that are not destructive and lethal. So it's like, I think that's an example of where I think a lot of these excuses result in a lack of imagination, not actually thinking it through. Now think it through. You've got unlimited resources. Think it through now. Like, how would you do this? And as a benevolent person, how would you do this? And you wouldn't do it the way that the natural world does, because the natural world isn't intelligently designed by a kind engineer. So that's an example of how the evidence is much more probable on naturalism than it is on theism, any version of theism that anyone wants to believe in.
I mean, one of the things we've already touched on, but just a bit of an elaboration here is the method that sort of divine, all-wise being decides to distribute his sort of ideas and messages is through individuals, very often ignorant and peasants around the world, and through books, and they sort of get changed over time. Even in the four Gospels, they couldn't even agree who was there to at the time of the empty tomb. There's different stories.
Yeah.
But Satan, Lucifer, can chat to you in your own accent and dialect and your vocabulary directly to you. So is he more superior then?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, yes, it's internal inconsistency there for sure. But of course, even with that, like we don't really have any evidence that Satan has ever actually done that. But with the thing is, you're mentioning all the ways that God supposedly communicates with us. They're all conveniently, mysteriously, exactly the way ordinary humans do it, right? So it's like it looks exactly like humans making stuff up and trying to sell it on other people. And so why would God make a world that looked exactly like a world with no God in it? That's exactly what we're talking about here. Is that he's left the thing to look exactly like what would happen if there wasn't a God. That you have to explain that, like there, and you can't just come up with an explanation because you don't know that explanation is probable, right? So it's not enough to just make it possible. You have to show that it's probable. And that's where the evidence falls down. There's no evidence for any kind of weird theory you come up with, but you still also have to come up with that weird theory, whatever it is, to explain why God does everything as if there's no God. And which is a really strange behavior.
The argument from objective morality, objective moral values, and they talk about it as like they exist and therefore God exists. But the books, I mean, and so we're talking about the holy text, and they're supposed to be transferring of these moralities. Look at them changing over time to, based on the geography at the time. I mean, slaves. What the hell has happened to them? If moral values were really objective, why slavery? It took a mere human being to actually abolish that.
Yeah, that's a good example. I think Matt Dillahunty, atheist thinker in the U.S. He points that out. So when people say, "Well, how could you improve the Bible?" and he says, "Well, just slavery, right? Like day one, slavery, immoral, don't do it. Like that should have been in there." And the renunciation of it isn't in there at all. Like not even Jesus comes along and says, "Oh, you know what? The slavery thing, you should stop doing that." No, even he uses slavery as a positive moral model for how God should run the universe. Like he never denounces slavery at all. And in the letters of Paul's saying, slaves, be obedient. He's never saying, "Oh, slavery is immoral. You've got to get rid of your slaves, free your slaves." No, he never says that. And so, it just shows like you said, like the moral beliefs change and evolve over time, and just conveniently, mysteriously change and evolve with human knowledge. So as humans start to realize that they don't like something, it's like, the world with slavery in it is actually a worse world from our own perspective, like our own subjective perspective. It's a worse world. So maybe we shouldn't have it. Right. It's like humans have to come up with these ideas over time, and they're the ones who make the changes in morality. They always come from humans first, and then someone will come along and give God credit for it. But it's like, God has been here since, day one. He would have given us that memo way back then, but he didn't know. It looks like evolved morality. And I have a whole section on that in my Bayesian counter-apologetics article that I'm riffing on today, where I showed like they're actually objective moral reasoning actually can be derived from the natural world. You don't need a God for it. In fact, a God doesn't make a whole lot of sense as the origin of it at all, really. But you can explain the history of morality better with naturalism. And you can also explain the trajectory, like where we're going, like what is the better moral. You can show that like current morals are better than ancient morals with objective facts of the world about human nature and about societies and so on. And so naturalism makes more sense of why those things are, whereas theism does not make as much sense. It doesn't make that evidence probable in the way that naturalism does. And it's important to point this out. And this is one of the key things in Sense and Goodness Without God, the book that I wrote, is that the common fear, or at least the fear that's promoted by religious authorities, is that if you get rid of God, there's no reason to be moral. We'll just be like, setting up rape camps and skeet shooting kittens or whatever. Like it'll be just, the world will fall apart. It's like, no, actually, that's never been the case and will never be the case. Like humans pursue morality out of empathy and an understanding of how the world works and how things can reverberate back on them, but also in how they want to think of themselves. Like, people don't want to be the villain that they hate, because then they would hate themselves. People want to be the hero that they admire. They want to be something that they respect. And so you actually have levers in people already, just naturally evolved levers, because we are social animals inherently. So pro-sociality is something that we've actually evolved to actually already have motives to pursue. So you can appeal to that to get people to be good. And we see with statistics, when you look at atheists compared to believers, the moral differences there's no statistical difference at all, really, or very little in any case. And often it's the other way around. Oftentimes you find atheists, for example, atheists cheat less than religious people do. So it's like there's some evidence that atheists sometimes perform better, but most of the evidence overall that the difference is not significant. And so we don't need religion for morality. But it's important to note that, because you shouldn't just assume that if you give up God or give up religion that you're done. In reality, you really do need to replace that with something. You need to have a positive worldview. You need to have your own better theory of everything, including morality, should replace that. And so you should research that and figure out, like, what is the case morally if there is no God? Like, and what have people said about this? So people have been talking about it for 2,000 years. There's a lot of stuff to look at as to in terms of how morality comes out of the natural world and out of the human being's natural state. If you don't have a God. And so I think that's an important thing to think about, is the positive replacement belief that you come away with after you've realized that your religion is false.
Yeah. As you know, some of the strongest atheists in the world were very afraid of that vacuum. Nietzsche and Marx were afraid of that sort of vacuum, and you have to replace it. People sort of misunderstand their quotes, and they think that when he said God is dead, he was actually mourning the situation, because he was afraid of the immediate repercussions. He wants to do that sort of slowly and build up and replace, instead of just completely destroy the situation. And Steven Pinker, I was going to say, we can actually empirically and look at the numbers, the better nature of our angels.
Better angels of our nature. Yeah.
So sorry, that's correct.
Yeah.
It's
good book.
Over time, it's improving. The numbers are improving. We're becoming better. And if you take away the individualistic tendencies, because of sort of an individual as being sort of an atheist or agnostic, but countries where religions are sort of practiced less, and they have secular standards, the crime rates, the teen pregnancy, every element is a lot better than Afghanistan, for example.
Gregory Paul did several sociological studies showing this, that when you compare, not even just state by state, or not country by country, but even within the United States, state by state, you can show the track of religiosity always always correlates badly with social markers of, like you said, crime rate and teen pregnancy, STDs, even, all these marker poverty levels, happiness indexes, like you could just everything. Religion seems to make things worse, whereas when you go secular, things seem to improve.
Away from the Bible Belt.
Yes, correct. It is funny. It's you go from the south to the north, and then you go to Canada. Yeah, indeed. Except we got the outliers, like Alaska's out there. And
we hear they're very polite.
Practically a southern state.
They're too polite in Canada, we hear.
They actually are. I can vouch for this. This is actually true. When I was in the military, we hit the port in Victoria, Canada at one point. And I remember I was walking from the docks to downtown or whatever. And I was going to jaywalk. I was going to cross the street, but I was like, as an American, I'm cautious, but I just literally just turned, like, just the thought. And so I just barely moved as if I was going to step into the street, and all the cars stopped. And that was like, it really struck me as really eerie. Like, what the hell just happened? And then I crossed the street. But I was like, that wouldn't happen in America. Like, nobody would even freaking stop. And that's just illustrates the difference of mindset, right? Of a culture. The ones you think, oh, actually, it makes sense. This person needs to cross the street. I should just slow down and stop and let him. It's like, that actually is really great. Like, so it gives you an idea of how, less religious, the more moral sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, our morality is not derived from holy texts.
Not really, yeah. It's the other way around, right? The morals come from the society and the culture, and then get thrown into the holy text, and God becomes the authority of it. It didn't really come from God to begin with. Yeah, that's why it changes and gets better over time.
Never did. The 10 Commandments. I mean, we examined the 10 Commandments. Is there any morality in them?
Yeah, like a little, right? Like you got to get rid of the first 5, right? I have an article on this. It's about America as a Christian nation, and I did this article on how we're not really, at least we weren't originally, a Christian nation. In fact, a lot of our Constitution, a lot of our founding documents, were specifically written to abolish and oppose the 10 Commandments. And you can look like the Constitution actually literally outlaws the first 5 commandments. If you like one after the other, like that's conscious and deliberate. Like they just said, no, this is a bad moral system. We're going to get rid of the crap in it. Now, if you get to the other half, you've got some things, no theft, no bearing false witness in court. And originally that was a perjury law, not a lying law. But so things like that. There are some things, and some things are a little more dodgy in the other 5. But there are some like standard morals. But those things already existed before the Bible came along. Like you go back to Hammurabi's code, and it's already there, right? So, he claims he got it from the pagan sun god, right? So the sun god came down and told him, "Don't steal stuff." But yeah, that's and then he carved it. Hammurabi carved it in stone.
Yeah.
So, and the whole Moses tale is a ripoff of that, really. It's a cheap knockoff. Yeah, it's a cheap the stone tablets. It's a cheap knockoff of the Sumerian Babylonian system. But anyway, with their own stuff added in. And the stuff they added in is often terrible stuff, not really highly moral stuff at all. But I do an article on that, and I show how like the 10 Commandments are not that great. But if you look at the 10 Commandments of Solon of Athens, who is an early, maybe mythical, maybe historical, we don't know. But anyway, he's one of the great sages of early Athenian history, upon which Athenian democracy was built. And he had his own sort of 10 Commandments that he delivered. And he didn't claim they came from God. He claimed that they were just obvious things that he reasoned out. And they're much better. You go look at those. They're way better 10 Commandments. And these things were probably written around the same time historically. So how is it that, the Old Testament God is writing this barbaric, terrible stuff, while at the same time this Joe Blow over in Athens off of his own reasoning and just observing the world and thinking comes up with a better 10 Commandments? You can't. That's not easily explicable. It's very improbable.
Probably a more refined civilization, and it actually follows from if morality is a human made, then you would expect a better, more advanced civilization to come up with better solutions.
Yeah, I mean, you could put it that way. And also, a long time ago, I wrote on the idea that the way Greece grew up into democracies is that they didn't have a unified kingdom. So they weren't like a tribe where you just beat people down for social dominance. There's one person in charge and everybody better listen or they get killed, right? Which is what the Old Testament depicts, right? Everybody fallen party wiped out, either deliberately killed by Moses' command or zapped by angels or something. But in Greece, because the country was so geographically divided by mountains and islands and stuff, they didn't really have a unified leader. So they had a bunch of independent communities that sort of worked together collectively within themselves. And then they had to interact, right? And so the only way to do this was to argue, right? They couldn't just come in and conquer. Yeah. So they had to persuade. And to persuade, they had to give evidence to convince people to well, let's have this agreement. And so and that's how democracy grew up, right? As it became this, and now it became a point of like, well, wait a minute, how do we know what you're saying is true? So epistemology became important, right? Like this idea of how do you, and then trickery, like the idea of rhetoric. Okay, they're trying to trick us with fallacies and stuff. So now you have to detect fallacies, right? So all of this architecture, this armament of logic and thinking grew out of this need because of democracy. The way it works, you have to work with persuasion rather than beating people over the head with, hammers and swords. They had to persuade, and so they had to have epistemology. Epistemology led to looking at the world that way. Yeah. So that led to philosophy and led to science and the whole deal. And so it was really.
Hey, I've got to ask you this question: being one of the lead mythicists in the world, Dr. Carrier, Socrates, I mean, the guy who probably never existed. What do you think? I mean, this is the guy who was walking around challenging everybody.
We actually have good evidence that Socrates existed.
Okay.
Yeah, for people who don't know what we're talking about, I am renowned for having published the first peer-reviewed, extensive, thorough case for the possibility that Jesus didn't exist. That he was originally a person that you met in dreams and visions, like the angel Moroni for Mormonism, or the angel Gabriel in Islam, and that later he was put into history in myths, making him a normal man and so on. That theory I have written an extensive academic defense of. I don't conclude that it's absolutely certainly what happened, but I think it's slightly more likely the truth of what happened in the origins of Christianity. And yes, because I'm known for this, people will often throw things at me like, well, what about Socrates? And what about Spartacus? What about Hannibal? And, and so they give me all these things. And I've written, so my latest book, which is Jesus from Outer Space, I have a whole chapter on these what ifs. I call it the argument from Spartacus. It's like, but if we have to doubt Jesus, then we have to doubt Spartacus, or, this is the way it usually goes. But Socrates is one of these people that usually gets listed. Now, in my original book on the historicity of Jesus, I have a whole section on Socrates where I show that Socrates has way more evidence for his existence than Jesus does. And I actually make that explicit point. And I think people often don't know how much evidence we have for Socrates and why it makes his historical existence highly probable. And the absence of that evidence isn't there. So for Jesus, so that the absence of evidence for Jesus makes Jesus less probable than Socrates, right, as a historical person. But for people who want all of that, I put all of that in Jesus from Outer Space, and I've done it for Socrates, Alexander the Great, various emperors, Tiberius. I've done various other lesser famous people, Herod and Typus and so on. There's tons of examples of these, Socrates being one of them. So that's in there for people who want to check that out. And it's useful for people who want to know how historical evidence works in general. Like, how do we know something is probable in the past versus improbable in the past? The book is very handy for that. Even if you don't care about the Jesus thing in general, it's a useful book for learning about history and how history works.
It's very interesting. I must read this myself, because I've been sort of not quite sure about Socrates. Obviously, his writings were nowhere to be found, and Plato.
Yeah, he himself never wrote. In fact, I think he didn't think writing was an effective way to teach, so he was kind of anti-writing in a way. But so it was his disciples, and he had multiple disciples that wrote, and we have their works. So we have Plato and we have Xenophon, both wrote. And we have their works, but there were actually like a dozen others, more than, who also wrote. And we have references to their names and to the books they wrote. We don't have their books, but we have people who read them and knew them. And Aristotle, of course, was Plato's student, and so Aristotle, could attest directly to Plato and Socrates and so on. So we have some, and there's a lot of other references to Socrates in different sources and so on, from people who were there or who personally knew people who were there. And which is exactly the kind of thing we don't have for Jesus. Contrary to Christian apologetic, none of the Gospels say they get their information from actual named people who were there. None of them claim to be from there. Even the Gospel of John, which is the last one to be written, claims to have gotten some of its information from something written by supposedly some unnamed person who supposedly knew Jesus, which is, it's like, I know a friend of a guy who told me, which is the worst as far as historical evidence. No, we have much better stuff for Socrates than we have for Jesus. Yeah.
I mean, to me, Paul is a key figure. Most people probably don't know that, but they think the Gospels would be the first.
Correct. It's Paul's authentic letters predate the Gospels by at least 20 years. And that's another thing people don't know, is that only half the letters in the New Testament are actually written by Paul. The others that are claimed to be written by Paul are forgeries, and that is the mainstream consensus. That's not some fringe theory. That's the mainstream view now among experts, is half the letters of Paul are forged in his name.
Would that be including the one who seems to be a bit chauvinistic?
Yes, women? In fact, you're thinking of 1 Timothy. where it has the most misogynistic passage in the whole Bible. Literally, someone forged that to make Paul say that. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians, there's a verse that echoes that. There's good evidence that Paul didn't write that verse. So someone added a verse to one of the authentic letters to make Paul denounce women. When you look, and ironically, when you look like the chapter before, Paul is saying the exact opposite about women. So we know Paul himself was much more egalitarian. He did think women should wear a hijab, at least in when praying. So like if they were in church or praying, they should wear hijab. That was his view, and he had a weird superstitious reason for that. But in general, like women could have positions of authority. There's some evidence that he recognized women as apostles, even like that they could have visions of Jesus appointing them as apostles, and they have apostolic authority, which to Paul was the highest rank you could achieve in the church at the time. So the actual evidence of Paul is that he was much more egalitarian about women, but the church itself evolved back into a much more misogynistic, sexist, hierarchical view. And so they had to forge material and doctor sentences to get Paul to push their anti-woman view later. And so that this, as history, it's fascinating. It can be very disorienting for a Christian to realize that this is the kind of fraud and deception that their religion is based on.
Sure. Now, I want to get to the final point probably of our conversation. I kept you for long enough, Dr. Carrier, but it's the one that most atheists recognize is the strongest argument the theists usually have, which is the argument from fine-tuning. Because according to Sean Carroll, because it plays by the book.
Right. And I think even Hitchens, I think, said if he had to pick one, what would he say was the best one? And he said he still agreed it didn't hold up, it didn't wash, but he did say it's the best of the ones, at least. This falls to the same logic, right? And I base this on the work of Ikeda and Jeffries and Sober. All of these mathematicians and scientists have written articles demonstrating what I'm about to explain here. But it's the same thing. When you put evidence in that people leave out, the argument flips the other way. And it works like this. So let's take seriously the hypothesis that there was no God. Okay, so if there was no God, how could we exist? There's certain things that had to have been the case. So first of all, the universe it would have to be a natural accident. So you'd have to have the origin of life, which requires a highly improbable chemical combination by random, a lot of random mixing. Eventually one pops out and is self-replicating. And then you have evolution, etc. So you need, and to have a random accident like that of a very low probability, to have that to be highly probable, you need a really vast universe that's really old. So you need lots of time, lots of stuff. So you have lots of random mixing. So the odds that you'll get this random output is very high, right? Because you're trying over and over again. So on that theory, so we need a really vast universe, a really old universe. It has to be filled with tons of stuff. And because the universe wouldn't have been designed specifically for life, we should expect that universe to be actually, in fact, extremely hostile to life. It's only very rarely, in very fortunate circumstances of random chance, can life get a foothold and survive. And so that's what we expect to see if there's no God. Now, if there is a God, we don't expect to see any of that at all. That doesn't explain why the universe is, more than 30 billion light years across, right? Which is, it's unfathomably huge. 14 billion years old. That's even the Earth is 5 billion years old. It's crazy long times. Why there's so much stuff in the universe and why the universe is so incredibly hostile to life. If you looked at the universe, you look at it, 99.999% of the universe is a lethal radiation-filled vacuum, absolutely lethal to life. And then if you look at the 0.0001% of what's left, 99.999% of that is stars and black holes, which is absolutely lethal to life. So now we're way down in the percentages. And if you look at what's left, 99.99% of what's left is cold, dead planets that life can't survive on, or they're too hot, they're whatever. So literally, if you were to walk into a house and 99.999999999% of everything in that house was absolutely lethal to life, and that somewhere the tiny little atom of life was just barely clinging into a corner, into the one little mote of safety that it could find, would you conclude that that house was intelligently designed for life? Well, no, obviously not. That would be the exact opposite of what you would conclude. Now, all of this is exactly what we expect if there's no God. None of it is what we expect if there is a God. God would just make a universe completely hospitable to life, and he wouldn't need all that time. He wouldn't need all that space. He wouldn't need all of that material. In fact, it would look more like Aristotle thought the universe looked like, where most of the land was on Earth. Everything revolved around the Earth. It was fairly small, and you could go live up in outer space. Like, space was breathable. Like, there was, it had an ethereal atmosphere, so you had to have special animals that lived there. But he thought it was still inhabitable, like everything in the solar system was inhabitable. He just thought you could just keep going up and go live up there. But that's what you would expect, right? So the thing is, the God hypothesis doesn't explain this. Now, the other thing is, like, for it to all happen naturally, you need a sort of just random hodgepodge of stuff, right? So you would need, there would be no intelligent design. So you would need, like, the complex periodic table of just random shit thrown together. And then out of that random shit, you would get life. But if you have very few things, the probability that you could get random stuff that would produce something complex like life is lower, actually. So we expect, in fact, we know for a fact that all godless universes that would have life that could observe it, and so in other words, for us to be talking about it, all godless universes will be fine-tuned. The probability is 100%, right? So, like, there's no universe that will ever have life observing it that's godless that isn't finely tuned. So fine-tuning is actually evidence of a godless universe, whereas a God doesn't need fine-tuning. A God doesn't need a complex standard model of particle physics. A God doesn't need 8 different kinds of gluon and 12 different kinds of quark to make a universe. He doesn't need any of this stuff. So all of these physical constants that are supposed to be finely tuned, God has no need of any of that. Only godless universes will have that, right? So this actually, fine tuning is evidence for naturalism. That's exactly what we expect to observe. And then you have to ask yourself, like, why would God make this extremely uselessly large, old, finely tuned, like delicately tuned, complex universe that he doesn't need to make to have a universe? In other words, why does he make the universe look exactly like a universe with no God in it? And that's the biggest problem that theism faces, and that's why how fine tuning turns in on itself when you do that.
I've got a comment here, and I think so. Why are you guys talking about God of religions? Well, what about a deistic God? But I think you're just literally addressing the deistic God. You haven't even got to religion at this point. Because I mean, isn't a sign of a good engineer or architect the amount of wastages to be minimized? And
right. No, that's true. Robert Ingersoll has a famous little parable about the carriage, this incredibly fabulously elaborate, ridiculously complex carriage, and where he shows, like, this actually is evidence of bad design, not evidence of good design. Now, when you're getting away from traditional religions, however, if you're getting into deism, well, you open up a range of hypotheses that are rejected already by most people, and really no religious person is going to accept them. Like, for example, you can have a sociopathic. You say, well, there was a God and he designed everything. And yeah, he's a total sociopath that doesn't give a shit about us, right? Like, you could say that. You can propose that as a hypothesis. The arguments you would then give against that would be different ones, right? Because you're now proposing motives that would be more in line with this. And then you would have to say, well, this God is limited. Like, he doesn't have supernatural capabilities, so he has to make a complex universe with quarks and gluons and all of this stuff because he can't make a universe any other way. So you now notice we're modifying the hypothesis. We're making it further and further away from what any religion will accept about a God. But as you do that, there are still reasons to say that there's no reason to think that exists. There's no reason for that. That explanation is not needed. As I can't remember if it was Laplace who told Napoleon.
It was
Napoleon
Laplace,
he said, like where there's no God in your book. And it's like, well, I have no need of that hypothesis. I can explain everything without him. So why do I need a God? And that's what happens to deism. It's like, you can explain everything with ontological naturalism. You don't need deism. It's a superfluous hypothesis at that point.
One of the very first practical applications of Occam razor.
Yeah, right. Well, actually, Occam's razor goes back to Ptolemy, at least. I should talk about this in The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, my book on ancient science. Ptolemy actually formulates one of the earliest versions of Occam's razor, and you could probably find earlier versions even than that. It's a seemingly obvious logical principle that people have hit upon multiple times, but it definitely applies here.
It's like the golden rule. You get different versions, and it's been attributed to Christianity, but it's actually older. I think it's Rabbi Hillel or something like that.
Yeah, and may even be older than that. But yes, for sure, we can trace it back. We can even find examples. Yeah, Confucius has a version of it, and so on. I have an article on that too for people who are interested in the origins of the golden rule. I have a few paragraphs in one of my essays on morality and moral theory. Where it derived, people thought of it independently all over the place because it's kind of an obvious, it's a version of game theory. And so so people are coming up with primitive notions of game theory because you can just observe how societies work and how the human mind works. And you can actually just, empirically infer the golden rule is actually the best way to run things. And it is, like, you can objectively prove that societies work better if people follow the golden rule, and consequently the people in the societies benefit more. Their lives are better if the society will run that way. And so it's a good example of game theory where cooperation actually makes things better for the cooperators as well as the whole. So another example of how moral theory can evolve out of just common sense and empiricism. You don't need any religion or God to tell you this stuff.
In an Arabic episode I had months ago, I was sort of I was talking about the Euthyphro paradox, and which plays on the rules of logic, the non-identity, non-contradiction, and it's seemingly the God they're talking about cannot break these rules, and so also the fine-tuning. It's the same thing. It's like God is bound by it's a cake recipe, and for you to have that perfect cake, you got to follow the recipe. Then if that God is bound by these rules, then what makes him a God then? I mean,
that means there's something more powerful than God that's restraining God, which means that God is not the most powerful thing. There's something preceding God that he can't even defeat that is constraining him. And like you said, that like with fine tuning, that you're suggesting that there's some sort of greater God that is saying, no, God, you have to do it this way. You can't do it any of these other ways. And the same with, like you just said, with morality. It's the same way. Like where does God's morality come from? Like either this, the Euthyphro dilemma is like, either God decides what is moral, in which case he could decide whatever he wants, so that he's not constrained by anything. So why would he choose these morals versus something else? Or there's only one morality God can choose, which means there's some greater law that didn't come from God, that he didn't design or choose, that is constraining him and limiting him. And if that's the case, you could take God out, and that thing, whatever it is still there. So we don't need God for morality, right? So it's either a completely arbitrary whim, or we don't need God for it. So, and if it's an arbitrary whim, we don't need God for it either. If we can just use our own arbitrary whim, if it's just going to be arbitrary whim. But really the ultimate it comes down to is, suppose it's arbitrary whim. You could argue, well, God is wiser and more knowledgeable than us. So if he's going to whim his way to a morality, just come up with one, he would come up with a better one. But what you're saying is like, well, then all we need is more knowledge and more wisdom. You're saying that moral truth can be discovered from knowledge and wisdom. So we don't need God. We just need knowledge and wisdom, right? So that's what history shows, that as humans became more knowledgeable and more wise, our moralities became more defensible and better for everybody.
Dr. Carrier, I really enjoyed the conversation with you today. It's time just flew, and
it's been great.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. People are loving it, and I'm sure it's like 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm sure more people be watching this. And I was wondering, do you have any final points that you'd like to make?
I don't have any final points. I think we covered everything. We did a really good survey of the perspectives here. The only thing I would suggest to people, if you want to pursue any of this stuff more, like I have the books on my website. I have a lot of blog articles on lots of subjects, so you can go check things out there. I also teach courses online, fairly affordable courses, 1-month courses in philosophy and in ancient history and so on. Counter-apologetics. I do a little bit of Christian and Muslim counter-apologetics. For people who are interested in maybe taking some of those courses, on my website at richardcarrier.info. Up top menu, there's a take courses link that you can go and see if that would interest you if you want to do that. So that's one way to go further in. Another way to go further in is, like I said, search my blog for all kinds of different topics. I've got lots of things that I've written about there. And then, of course, all my books and so on. My social media you can follow from there and so on.
Indeed, I've read a couple of your books. I've watched most of your debates, even prior to this conversation. It's been years since I've been watching your stuff, and I've always enjoyed your very pragmatic way of approaching situations. I think I remember that debate with Dan Barker, and it was almost like a good cop, bad cop sort of situation, because Dan is very.
We did that on purpose.
Nice.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It works. It did work back then as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I look, guys, please go and have a look at Dr. Richard Carrier's website. I've got it in the description there. Have a look. There's a lot of links to his work, his books, and I think you can benefit a lot from his way of thinking. One more time, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, it's been great. I'm glad to have been able to do this for you.
Brilliant. Okay, guys, I'll see you tomorrow in another episode. Thank you.